Oh, Horace, why? Don't leave me. Not you. Not like the others. Oh, and we meet again. Have you seen Horace anywhere? I've searched high and low with no luck. Perhaps he's left the catacombs. Oh, Horace, where have you run off to? Have you abandoned me? No. What a horrible thought. Forgive me, Horace. It pains me to leave you.
Hello everyone, this is Aegon of Astora. Welcome back to Dark Souls 3 Let's Talk Lore. This is episode number 14 being recorded on Friday the 19th of May. I hope you're all having a fantastic day whenever it is you find yourself watching this. I would briefly like to apologize for the delay in getting this episode to you. I had in fact originally planned to record this episode on Friday, May the 5th, so 2 weeks ago today. And that also means that all of the comments and overlays that I prepared for this episode, I prepared on the 3rd of May. So if you left a comment on any of the previous episodes after the 3rd of May, I apologize, but as usual, I gathered way too much and prepared way too much to talk about for this episode, so I'm just going to stick with the comments that I've already prepared, and I prepared them again 2 weeks ago. So again, my apologies. A bunch of real life stuff came up that conspired, I guess, to ensure that I wouldn't record on the 5th, most notably to do annual progress report thing that all doctoral students have to do in my program at least, and then I had to prepare for a conference, and then after all of that, a heat wave hit Toronto that was such that I had to vacate my apartment and go stay with family for a while. So obviously I wasn't able to pack up my PS4 and all my recording equipment and bring it with me, so I had to wait until I returned home until I was able to record. So I returned home today, and this is one of the first things I'm doing. It is still brutally hot in my apartment, but I'm gonna try and brave it anyway, because the air conditioning isn't getting switched on until the 1st, in all likelihood, so the 1st of June that is. So I would rather not wait until then to record this episode. So you will all have to bear with me and accept my sincerest apologies if the quality of this episode suffers as a result. So this is the Smouldering Lake. As I mentioned, or at least as I ought to have mentioned in the previous episode, we are only going to be doing one episode on this area, so this is surely going to be a very long episode. Let's start with our first fun with definitions. As a verb, smolder means to burn slowly with smoke but no flame, or to show or feel barely suppressed anger, hatred, or another powerful emotion, or to exist in a suppressed or concealed state. As a noun, smolder can mean smoke coming from a fire that is burning slowly without a flame. So I feel like to a certain degree or another, all of those things apply to the Smouldering Lake. So enemy names. We have basilisks. There is a single black knight, the Carthus Sandworm, which is rather interesting, we'll talk about in a little bit. Then there are demon clerics and demon statues. The demon statues are a returning enemy from Dark Souls 1. The demon clerics are a new enemy. There are great crabs, hound rats, large hound rats, skeleton swordsmen, and skeleton wheels, so bone wheels. And then there's an assortment of smoldering enemies. So as with the other areas, some of these names come from the actual area part of the guide, and some of them come from the bestiary at the end of the guide. I can't recall which are which, but I'm reasonably certain that the smoldering enemies, the more specific ones, come from the back of the guide. But in any case, we have Smouldering Bastard Grue, which I believe are the ones that the Grue that are on all fours. And I should also mention that I did a live stream where we sort of talked about this area in advance of us recording this episode. It was part of my Soul Level 1 live stream that we started almost a year ago, but we will eventually finish. But in that live stream, I can't remember if we got an answer to this question, but one of the things I was wondering about the name Smouldering Bastard Grue is whether or not the Japanese word used for bastard Grue is a toshigo, which means a child that is unwanted. I would recommend returning to the episode, the second part on the Cathedral of the Deep with JSF and Kassadov, because we talked about the implications for that in that episode. But yeah, Yosaho, if you're watching, I'm wondering if you can check your sources to see what the name is in Japanese for the Smouldering Bastard Grue, because I'd be very interested to hear what the case is there. Then we also just have plain Smouldering Grue, the Smouldering Grue Conjurators, the Mad Smouldering Grue, and Smouldering Rotten Flesh. So we will of course return to all of those things a little bit later, but yeah, for now let us proceed with the area. So there's a giant ballista that is somehow automatically homing in on our position, but we'll deal with that a little bit later. The ballista is actually going to be, if I look at my handwritten agenda here, after we talk about Horace, we're going to talk about the Sandworm, and then we are going to deactivate the ballista shortly after that. So as we head into this cave here, we find that there are 2 crystal lizards. And as I mentioned in the previous episode, I can't recall exactly where I read this or where I heard this suggested, or whether or not it was something that I came up with on my own. I don't think the latter is the case, but it doesn't seem entirely unlikely to suggest that when Henri says, "I will lay prism stones to guide him as always," that in some way, shape, or form, Horace mistook those crystal lizards for prism stones and followed them in here. And we see, of course, that Horace has met his end at the hands of John Grimm the Reaper. So before we get into that, in the previous episode, something else that I was wondering aloud about, and that Mitch and I couldn't really come to a satisfactory explanation for, is how Horace and Henri initially came to be separated. And we got a comment from Gummo5555, who writes, "On the subject related to Henri and Horace, maybe the disguised pilgrim of Londor was the cause of their separation." Yes, absolutely. This seems to be the most likely explanation. I was hoping in the previous episode to come up with a more specific, precise explanation for this, but in the absence of that kind of explanation as to how they got separated, being able to point to a specific trap which could have possibly separated them in the spot where we find Henri, and then the spot initially, and then the spot where we find Horace later on, that is right here. This seems, like the most likely explanation, because there is a pilgrim who is leading Henri towards an end that we will explore later on, at the behest of Yuria of Londor. So, I'm not really sure I have much more to add to that, other than to say thank you, Gummo, for pointing this out, because as I was editing the footage for the previous episode, this same thought occurred to me, like, oh, well, that seems to be by far the most likely explanation. So thank you, Gummo, for bringing this up. On the spot where Horace was killed by John Grim the Reaper, we have the Llewellyn shield. The description for which reads, metal shield crafted by the Great Smith, fashioned from rare Justeel, it excels at various types of damage absorption. And when we go to Firelink later on, we find that the Executioner set is available for purchase at the Shrine Handmaid, the description for which reads, steel helm of Horace the Hushed, who took a liking to its cold, bulky insides. The original owner was said to be a corrupt executioner who was killed and stripped of his armor. Horace is one of only 2 children to escape Aldrich's clutches. So the other child to have escaped Aldrich's clutches would seem very obviously to be Henri of Astora. And we're obviously going to be talking a great deal about Henri of Astora a little bit later on, so I think I'm going to leave it at that for now. We do have some dialogue later which will attune us to some other stuff that's going on, and to what end Henri is being led by a pilgrim of Londor. But I think we're just going to leave it at that for now. So something else I should mention is that in the previous episode, I kind of screwed up by speaking with Henri and then defeating High Lord Volnir, because I wanted there to be a mural here. And so I have, of course, captured footage of the mural, as you will have seen in the introduction. But if you take care of Horace before killing High Lord Volnir, and then you speak with Henri, and you tell her about the Smouldering Lake, she will set up a vigil for Horace with his halberd and his shield and a prism stone. I don't know about any of you, but that's just really heartbreaking, heart-wrenching stuff, especially given Henri's apparent fear of abandonment and feeling as though Horace is really the only person she has in the world. So next on the agenda is the Sandworm. So we're going to be taking care of the Sandworm before we proceed to deactivate the Ballista. And the reason for that, for anyone who isn't lactose intolerant, is simply that the Ballista provides a very easy way to cheese the Sandworm, and we are going to take full advantage of that. We do also have some very interesting comments which deal with the Ballista and its purpose, why it's here. Stop it. Logan Shepley writes, on the topic of the Colossal Avalon, is it possible that it was built by Carthus to keep the worm in check? Seeing as it kept on coming back as the yellow bug pellets suggest, it could make sense for the Avalon to also damage the worm, given that it's trying to attack you, but you gave me the idea of enemy teams having quite some value. Like I said, not any lore aficionado, but food for thought. Another more likely theory I had in regards to the Avalon was that it was for keeping those pesky demons in check. The bolts it fires are clearly capable of breaking through the surface ruins of the Smouldering Lake, assuming they are demonic in nature, suggesting it forced the demons underground to the ruins proper, hence all the demon jazz being down there. Heaven's Knight writes, I always thought the Ballista was moved there by the giants to attempt to kill the Sandworm, and clearly you can use it for that very purpose. But as it targets and attacks you as soon as you enter, maybe it's there to protect something. Deso Penguin writes, my personal take on the Ballista overlooking Smouldering Lake is that it was placed there by the builders of the catacombs, note the various skeletons nearby, including Carthus Swordsman, for the purpose of protecting against any demons that might attempt to come up from below. Centimeter Worm writes, the Carthus Sandworm is something that I find simultaneously fascinating and disappointing. There's this morbidly intriguing motif throughout Dark Souls 3 of body horror and bodily corruption. Things that were once human morphing into things that are somewhere between human and something more bestial. Major disclaimer, I know that a lot of people tend to chalk up the body horror elements in Dark Souls 3 to Bloodborne cross-pollination, but I personally find the thematic center of its usage in Dark Souls 3 to be extremely different from its usage in Bloodborne. As such, I prefer to take what is presented in Dark Souls 3 on its own terms, rather than basically saying, oh, it's just there because Bloodborne, which, while perfectly understandable, is a perspective that I think lacks depth and is unsatisfying. End disclaimer. The Carthus Sandworm is one of the plethora of examples of body horror in Dark Souls 3, and is a slightly subtler one because you have to look very close to actually see where the horror element is, which is kind of hard when being shot by ballistae and fried by lightning. If you examine it, you can see that the flesh under the sandworm's exoskeleton and inside its maw consists of contorted human faces and skeletal limbs reaching out between the ribs. Centimeter Worm provided some great screenshots per this post on Reddit, but I will try to see if we can get a closer look so that we can get that in motion in a moment. Centimeter Worm continues, I believe that you and Mitch suggested that the sandworm is the size it is because it consumed a number of corpses from the catacombs, but I suggest that the sandworm actually is those corpses. I can't pronounce that word. A gestalt organism created from a collected consciousness of undead human bodies dumped in the catacombs. So just for anyone who's wondering what that word means, a gestalt means an organized whole that is perceived as more than the sum of its parts. And that seems a very apt descriptor for the Carthus Sandworm. Centimeter Worm continues, let me explain my theory. Slimes are enemies in Dark Souls 1 and 3 that I've always found intriguing. The fact that they're actually called writhing rotten flesh in Dark Souls 3 gives this idea away somewhat, but their existence in Dark Souls 1 isn't actually explained in any way. I think people tend to take slimes in Dark Souls 1 for granted because it's such a common Dungeons and Dragons trope that you don't really think twice about them. But the implication in my mind is that the slimes in the game are actually formed from the collected residue and bodily fluids of undead humans that has somehow retained consciousness, forming on walls and ceilings like a slime mold. The undead curse has caused this human residue to form into its own kind of life. Similarly, in Dark Souls 3, we encounter the writhing rotten flesh in places like the Cathedral of the Deep, Anor Londo, and the Catacombs, places where there are countless piled bodies and damp, swampy murk composed of all manner of impurities. My thinking is that the flesh is actually the flesh of the bodies that has clung to life and developed its own gestalt will. With a name like writhing rotten flesh, maybe this idea is almost kind of obvious, but I think that if it can apply to the slimes, then it can almost certainly apply to the sandworm. I'm almost positive that the sandworm is a creature that is the result of a process similar to that which formed the slimes, and is possibly even comparable to how crystal lizards can grow into giant ravenous beasts. And just to address the fire slimes in the demon ruins, I think that it's probably fair to say that with all the dead demons around, the fire slime could be the demon equivalent of the undead slime. That one's maybe a bit of a stretch though. Willem of Latria writes in reply to Centimeter Worm, I have felt the same way for a while about soul power. Aldrich himself is an amalgam of those he has eaten, and demons are amalgams to a less extreme extent, and highly resemble beings like Ludwig from Bloodborne. Like you said, people might say that the body horror is just cross-pollination, but these themes have been present since Demon Souls. with the earwig creatures in Latria and also the miners in Stonefang Cave growing scales like how people in Bloodborne become beast-like. I also fully agree with your idea that the bodies of demons form the smoldering flesh. I think a key theme in Dark Souls is the fading of the flame leads to widespread rot, simply because there is not enough flame to burn the bodies of the dead, leading to much more physical and spiritual impurity, Kigare, than usual. Maybe New Londo was flooded as opposed to cleansed because the flame was not presently capable of burning all the corruption away, since the rise of the Four Kings was during the twilight of Gwyn's reign. So yeah, I'm not sure that I have a heck of a lot more to add to all of those, very thought-provoking and interesting comments. Let me just get to a safer spot before I continue that thought. Other than to clarify that when in the past, and I don't necessarily think that Centimeter Worm was referencing me in his disclaimer on the subject, but I did want to clarify that when I note that something is seemingly the result of the cross-pollination of the dev teams for Bloodborne as well as Dark Souls 3, I don't mean for that to be taken as or interpreted as a sort of hand wave that there's no way to explain it in Dark Souls 3 or it doesn't have any place in the story of Dark Souls 3. I think that something can both be the result of cross-pollination between the two games, but also Rip Sandworm. So those things can be a result of cross-pollination, but also in their own right be interesting and significant in the story of Dark Souls 3. I don't think those two things are necessarily mutually exclusive, but I am sympathetic to Centimeter Worm's sentiment that it shouldn't simply be used as a hand-waving technique to not explain things in Dark Souls 3, or to dismiss things that are in Dark Souls 3 as merely being the result of cross-pollination of dev teams. I think that it can be both things. It can be significant on its own merits in the story of Dark Souls 3, but also could have resulted from that cross-pollination. So this bonfire is called the Demon Ruins. And before we go any further, we have a lot of item descriptions to look at, so let's do that, starting with the ones we just picked up. So, Undead Bone Shard, we've read this before, but it's worthy of note that this came from the Carthus Sandworm, so lending a fair bit of credence to Centimeter Worm's theory about the Sandworm. But the Sandworm also drops the Lightning Stake, the description for which reads, "A lost dragon-slaying miracle. Strikes with a stake of lightning. This tale describes the lost practices of ancient dragon slayers, who found that in order to pierce dragon scale, lightning should not be hurled as a bolt, but rather be thrust as a stake directly into the dragon's hide, to be truly effective." What I find interesting but also simultaneously confusing about this spell and the item description is that it sort of contradicts the intro cinematic to Dark Souls 1. And this isn't the only item description to contradict what we thought we knew from previous games. We'll get into the other contradiction later. But yeah, I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts on this, because in Dark Souls 1 it was said that
Gwyn's mighty bolts peeled apart their stone scales. The witches weaved great firestorms. Nito unleashed a miasma of death and disease. And Seath the Scaleless betrayed his own, and the dragons were no more.
lightning peeled apart the stone scales of the dragons, and then the other lords used their abilities to defeat the dragons once their stone scales had been torn off by the lightning. So I don't know if this was something that came later but I don't know what dragons there would be to slay after the Age of Grey came to an end, because what dragons were left? We see Seath the Scaleless on top of a mountain of dead everlasting dragons, or as I think they're called in English in this game, archdragons. So, I don't know. We have a number of other items in this area that also relate to dragon slaying, so maybe we'll return to this in short order. We also picked up the Shield of Want, the description for which reads, Shield of an ancient king who was cursed by an all-consuming thirst. In the end, he was no king. The residue of the king's lust still smolders within the shield, increasing the number of souls absorbed when enemies are defeated. So this is one of the other contradictory items that we find in this area. And this is something that has confused me since my blind playthrough of the game, which if you go back, you'll find me basically asking the same questions. And that is, how is it that Vendrick became known as the King of Want, when in fact Vendrick went to great lengths to try to prevent Nashandra, the Queen of Want, from doing whatever it is she was planning on doing? And that's a whole can of worms that we can't really get into right now, but it's very strange to me. So if we look at what the item description for the shield says in Dark Souls 2, so in Dark Souls 2, this was called the King's Shield, and the description read, Shield of Vendrick, King of Drangleic. One fragment of dark, having taken human shape, became obsessed with the king's soul. Impelled by its own cravings, it sought souls and strove to make the strength of the giants its own. So I guess in this sense, it's not completely off base from what we saw in Dark Souls 2, because in Dark Souls 2, it does mention this is the shield of Vendrick, King of Drangleic, and then it goes on to talk about Nashandra. I'm curious that there's no gendered pronouns used in this description. It refers to Nashandra as an it, which is interesting, but I'm not entirely sure what to make of this other than perhaps, and I think I suggested the same thing in my blind playthrough of the game, that perhaps we're seeing some sort of historical forgetting at work here. That this shield, that Vendrick's legacy became tied to that of Nashandra. They were married after all, so that makes sense. In which case that would be an interesting inversion of the usual queen sort of serving the legacy of kings in medieval fantasy. So if we look also at Vendrick's armor, the king's armor, the description reads, Armor of Vendrick, King of Drangleic. What makes a king? Some say that it is birthright, while others call it destiny. Perhaps it is not important, as long as the king's name serves to unite his people. So perhaps that explains the line in this item description which says, in the end, he was no king. Because, you know, the description for his armor, it goes on and on about what makes a king. And in this instance, it would seem to suggest that Vendrick, he failed in uniting his people. So, yeah, I'm not sure. But we also picked up the speckled stone plate ring, which was something we had to make sure we got before deactivating the Ballista, because the only way for us to get it is to destroy that wall that we destroyed while I was talking about other things. But the description reads, Stone plates are symbols of true knights, and speckled stone plates are granted to those who face an endless journey. Slightly increases magic, lightning, fire, and dark damage absorption. Okay, so next, we are going to, so we're taking a very, very strange route through this area, to the point where we're not actually even going to have the Ballista destroy the ceiling that is covering the other bonfire that we've yet to get in this area. So this right here is the Demon Cleric. And we can see that it has, it looks almost like a Plague Doctor mask. But it also looks a fair bit like and they have this somewhat annoying attack where they're able to to summon these orbs of fire. And of course, when we defeat the Demon Cleric, the Orb of Fire goes with him. Or it, I should say. And this is a Capra Demon. And we can see even the weapons of the Capra, like they seem to have been impaled on... They seem to have been killed by their own weapons. So yeah, so the layout of the area is not something I'm a huge fan of. Because it is very Chalice Dungeon-esque. And not, I don't mean that... Like, I like the Chalice Dungeons. This is something I've talked about before, so I'm not going to go into it in great depth. But I do like the Chalice Dungeons. So those are just normal grooves, I think. The one that's spewing poison at us is obviously a Conjurator Brew. I was capturing footage in Dark Souls 2 of a couple things that we're going to talk about in this episode, and in the process I think I screwed up my parry timing, because the parry timing in Dark Souls 2 is very different than it is in this game. So maybe I'll try to rely less on parrying in this episode. So yeah, so we are incredibly overpowered, to the point where we really shouldn't have any problems with this area. But I am also incredibly rusty. I've not played since I did the dry runs for this area a couple weeks ago. This is one of the Smouldering Mad Grooves. And the ones we just fought were just Smouldering Grew and the Conjurator Grew. But we know that this is the Mad one because this is the one that jumps on your head. And, yeah, does that thing that we talked about in the first or second or both episodes on Farron Keep. I don't know that that will make any difference whatsoever, but let's try it. Oh no. So yep, these are definitely the Mad Grew. Oh, you. That was close. That was very close. You would think with all the spells and whatnot I have that I would have equipped Great Heal or something, but I guess not. So this right here is another Demon Cleric, but it has these growths coming out of it, which I'm open to hearing ideas about. Because I have no idea what that could mean, other than sort of reinforcing this theme that we see elsewhere of the demons being more or less a part of the architecture here. That this one is seemingly petrified. suggesting that, yeah, the demons are not only dying, and in most cases dead, but that they've been dying off for a very long time. That is a nasty trap there. Let's see if we have anything to deal with. We only have 6 lightning urns, so I probably shouldn't waste it on this one, but yeah, this is the Smouldering Rotten Flesh, as opposed to the rotten smoldering, or the rotten writhing flesh that we've seen elsewhere. Friend, no. Before we proceed to the Ballista, we have a comment from Whatchamacallit, who writes, in regards to the origins of the Grue, I think that the black bug pellets indicate that the Legion acolytes might have gone into Carthus as an attempt to deal with the abyssal manifestations. I imagine that these acolytes lost their way while facing such a terrible abyssal outbreak, and they were so desperate to find anything against the dark. They eventually wandered onto the Chaos Remnants and inherited demon culture and transformed into the demon-human hybrids they are now. So yeah, we can see in many ways the parallels between the Grue and the demons, including the horns that they have. They also have hooves, however you pronounce that word, their eyes. So yeah, they do look very demon-esque, but they're obviously not entirely demons. They're half-breeds, if you will. So part of the reason I don't want to say dislike, but my hesitation in sort of giving this area and its design my endorsement, if you will, not that my endorsement matters at all, is just that, yeah, I tend to get lost very easily here. And I think part of that has to do with just the fact that this is an optional area, and as such, I don't always come here, unless there's something specific I need. So this is an illusory wall here, but I don't want to open any illusory walls until we're actually going to be following those paths. So this was my concern. This is why I did a dry run of the area. Because I didn't want to get lost and then waste a ton of time just talking in circles. But yeah, we are going to come back for those illusory walls very soon. But for the first order of business is to take care of the Ballista. But we also want to do it in a fun, cheesy way. So this is just large Titanite shards. We are going to talk about the Daughters of Chaos shortly. And there's an item description there to that effect, but I do want to deal with these basilisks first. Because my original plan for this area was actually to summon both Great Swamp Cuculus and Knightslayer Tsorig. Oh, that was a wasted opportunity. But the problem is, every single time I've ever brought them here in hopes that they might make it through, they either die, or more often than not, they get cursed. Just like I almost did. They drop moss fruit, the description for which reads, a small clump of moss fruit temporarily boosts bleed, poison, frost, and curse resistance. All moss fruit is the same regardless of its color, and has the effects of moss of all colors. So yeah, so we're going to take care of all these basilisks, then we're going to go summon Cuculus and Tsorig, and then we're going to come back here. But through the magic of video editing, I will make sure that you don't see the entire run back. But first, let's have a look at the Izalith staff, the description for which reads, Ancient catalyst of the Witch of Izalith and her daughters, used long before the dawn of chaos and of pyromancy. With the birth of the Chaos Flame, the Flame Witches were at once both sorcerers and shamans. Faith adjusts the power of sorceries cast using this catalyst, and this staff also seems to boost the power of dark sorceries. So I don't think that Hidden Body works on the Ballista. But let's try it anyway. Nope. Of course not. Why would it? Wow, and Hidden Body has... that doesn't last very long at all. So Cuculus we're going to talk about a little bit later on. But she is very, very interesting. And we're also going to talk about the notion of the savage, of othering, of what it means to be modern, and modernity, and several other things that I think are very interesting and helpful in understanding the difference between the pyromancers, and in particular those of the Great Swamp, and the sorcerers, and particularly those of Vinheim. But we'll get into that a little bit later on. So now that we have defeated Tsorig, the invader Tsorig, in the Catacombs of Carthus, his summon sign becomes available. Hi, friend. So if you've seen I've only done 2 episodes in this series, simply because I haven't really had any time to do anything other than Let's Talk Lore since I made this video. But if you've seen my Fun with NPCs video on Knightslayer Tsorig, you should have a pretty good idea of why we came all the way back here to summon these NPCs. But if not, that should become clear very shortly. Okay, so now that we have cleared out all the basilisks, we should have no problem getting Cuculus and Tsorig to give us a helping hand here. With what, you ask? Well, with this guy. I can't believe they did it. Good job, team. Alright, so I don't think I can explain all this, but I'm going to try. But let's just start with the item descriptions and then go from there. Starting with the Fume Ultra Greatsword. This twisted sword, the heaviest of all Ultra Greatswords, resembles black slate. This weapon, said to belong to a trader from long ago, was so heavy that it found no owner and became a forgotten relic of history. So this sword belonged, of course, to the Fume Knight from Dark Souls 2 from the Crown of the Iron King DLC. And its description in Dark Souls 2 read, "Ultra Greatsword forged from the soul of the Fume Knight. The exile swordsman Raimi had the ability to expunge the black fog, but chose to live alongside it, in company of the Child of Dark that haunts his sword." So it mentions that it was made from the soul of the Fume Knight, and that could have also made the plain Fume Sword, which I don't believe was brought back in this game, but the description is essentially the same as that of the Fume Ultra Greatsword, except that it notes that it's imbued with the dark of Nadalia. There was an item in the base game of Dark Souls 2 which hinted at Raimi and his significance in the larger story of the game, and that was the Rebel's Great Shield, the description for which reads, "Shield of the Rebel Raimi. Raimi and Velstadt were known as the left and right arms of the king, until their wills clashed and Raimi was deemed a traitor. The Black Raven is despised as an augur of death, but it was Raimi's favorite bird." So the description for the Soul of the Fume Knight, from which these weapons are created, reads, "Soul of the Fume Knight that guards the dungeon of Broom Tower. Raimi was a distinguished knight who became infatuated with the Bride of Ash, and settled in this land of smoke and fog. The wondrous soul of this knight can be used to acquire numerous souls or to create something of great worth." So there isn't a heck of a lot there that tells us about who Tsorig was, beyond suggesting that Tsorig obtained this sword by having defeated the Fume Knight, or potentially from having defeated another person who defeated the Fume Knight at some point, or an ancestor of someone who defeated the Fume Knight. So the possibilities really are endless, so let's move on to the next item for now. So he also drops the Black Iron Great Shield, the description for which reads, "Great Shield made of black iron, deeply feared for its association with Knightslayer Tsorig. Black iron offers high defense and is particularly effective at warding off fire." I don't believe this item was in Dark Souls 2 in the same way that the Fume Ultra Greatsword wasn't in Dark Souls 1, but its description in Dark Souls 1 reads, "Great Shield of the Mighty Knight Tarkus, built of special black iron and even heavier than Knight Berenice's Tower Shield, especially resistant to fire attacks, and effective for shield bashing." So yeah, this item belonged to Black Iron Tarkus in Dark Souls 1. So whereas it says in Dark Souls 3 that this Black Iron Great Shield is deeply feared for its association with Knightslayer Tsorig, in Dark Souls 1 it was known to belong to the Mighty Knight Tarkus. And what's more is if we look at the item description for the Black Iron set which Tarkus wore, it reads, "Armor of Black Iron Tarkus, a knight known for his great strength. Built of a special black iron and providing strong defense, notably against fire, but so terribly heavy to be unwieldy to all but Tarkus himself." So in both Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 3, the Black Iron set and its shield were associated with a very specific person. In Dark Souls 3, it was associated with Knightslayer Tsorig, who was feared, whereas in Dark Souls 1, Tarkus himself may have been feared, but he was also known for his great strength, not necessarily for his willingness to murder people, for no apparent reason, just for being a really strong and seemingly gallant and friendly knight, who, at least in terms of the player character's experience in Dark Souls 1, he never invades, he never tries to do wrong by you, he drops his summon sign, he helps with the Iron Golem boss fight, and then you find his corpse in Anor Londo. What he was doing there, or where he was headed, is another question. It's possible that, I believe that the generally accepted view of what happens with Tarkus is that he fell from the rafters while trying to reach the keep at Anor Londo. But it's also possible, I think, that he was overwhelmed under the rafters, that he was trying to reach the painted world of Ariamis, but got overwhelmed by the painting guardians there. And the reason I suggest that is that we do find a Knight of Berenice in the painted world, so it's possible that maybe Tarkus was going there to, save that person there. So we don't know, we really don't know. But what I'm trying to say is that Tarkus was known for many things, most notably his great strength, but not for being an infamous killer. So I suppose it's worth reiterating that Tarkus doesn't use the Fume Ultra Greatsword because it wasn't in Dark Souls 1. What he uses instead is actually the weapon we're using right now, the Greatsword, but in Dark Souls 1 it was a fair bit smaller. But the Greatsword's description in Dark Souls 1 read, "One of the gigantic straight greatswords. Very few have what it takes to wield this incredibly heavy, damage-dealing monster. A favorite of the Knights Bereniki, known for their heavy armor and Black Iron Tarkus." So the Knights Bereniki were known for two things, for their heavy armor and for Black Iron Tarkus. But you know, it doesn't say anything about Tarkus being feared, it doesn't say anything about Tarkus being infamous, it's just that he was known. He was a famous knight. What's more is that when we go back to Firelink later, we find that the Shrine Handmaid has available for purchase the Black Iron set, the description for which reads, "Armor made of black iron, from the set of armor for which Knightslayer Tsorig was infamously known, offers extensive and particularly effective protection from fire." So again, we're seeing here that whereas Black Iron Tarkus was known, he wasn't infamously known in the same way that Tsorig is. So in many ways, Tsorig seems to be a subversion of what Black Iron Tarkus represented in Dark Souls 1. And he seems more generally sort of like the Bloody Crow of Cainhurst in Bloodborne, to have a bunch of stuff from different places where it's not entirely clear what it's all supposed to amount to. But you could look at what Knightslayer Tsorig is and say that, you know, maybe he's supposed to be a player character who has been around maybe since the Dark Souls 1 days. And there is precedent for this when you look at a character like Lap in the Ring City DLC. It's not inconceivable that one character could span the entire 3-game arc of Dark Souls because Patches did it. And in the end of the Ring City, this is made explicit that Patches has been alive for so long that he's begun to succumb to the sort of hollowing that we saw in Dark Souls 2, where the person starts losing their memories. They start losing a grasp on what their sense of self is. They don't know who they are anymore. So it's entirely possible that Tsorig has been around since Dark Souls 1, or that he has simply pillaged these items from people who have been around from those times, or who have, through one way or another, have come into possession of these items, and then they fell at the hands of Knightslayer Tsorig, who took these items upon himself and made them his own. So I'm not entirely sure about that, but we did also mention in the previous episode that Tsorig's ring, the Knightslayer's ring, is actually an item from Dark Souls 2. So he dropped this ring when we killed him as an invader in the Catacombs of Carthus, and the description reads, "Ring of the Savage Tsorig, more commonly known as the Knightslayer. Long ago, Tsorig engaged the guardians of an ancient city in a bloody confrontation, and returned with their rings as his prize, still frozen on their dismembered fingers." So if we are to evaluate what I just said against what this item description suggests, then Tsorig has been around at least since Dark Souls 2. Because, yeah, it says right here that he engaged the guardians of an ancient city in a bloody confrontation, and returned with their rings as his prize, still frozen on their dismembered fingers. So the frozen bit seems obviously to be a reference to Frozen Ilium Lois, the place where we originally found this ring in Dark Souls 2, but where it was named the Ivory Warrior Ring. Ring of the Guardians of Ilium Lois. Attacks greatly reduce enemy stamina. Ilium Lois existed to subdue the raging flame, but when the ivory gates were flung open, the land grew cold and lifeless. So there could also be a sense in which Tsorig is attracted to chaos, that he himself is sort of a manifestation of chaos for one reason or another, because how else would we explain him killing himself here? Because again, FromSoft would have to have known. There's no way that FromSoft would have put in a summon sign for Tsorig in the same area where we can fight Tsorig as a hostile person. there's no way that they wouldn't have taken into consideration the possibility that someone would summon Tsorig and bring Tsorig to fight Tsorig. It strains credulity, as far as I'm concerned, to suggest that they wouldn't have considered that possibility. Certainly they make it difficult, because you have to get your way through all the basilisks, and it's very difficult to get NPCs through that area without having them die. But it does seem to me that this is a possibility that FromSoft would have accounted for. So if FromSoft accounted for this, how does this make sense in the context of the story? And the answer to that question, it seems to me, is once again looking at the multiverse-ness of the world of Dark Souls 3. How this is just one of several different places where, implicitly or explicitly, the multiverse understanding of the world of Dark Souls 3 is invoked as a way of, maybe not in this case, making character motivations clear, as I certainly don't think they're necessarily clear in light of this, but if we turn to our next fun with definitions, we do get a little bit of clarity, I think, in terms of how this makes sense and why Tsorig would be willing or able to fight himself, given our understanding of the multiverse aspect of the story and how the characters in the story all exist in infinite different forms and in infinite different space-time continuums. There are an infinite number of Knightslayer Tsorigs, and one Tsorig has absolutely no qualms about killing another Tsorig. Tsorig doesn't stop and say, oh, that's me from another part of the multiverse, I should not kill that person. He doesn't care. He goes right after himself. No problem, doesn't think about it for a second. And you could say, oh yeah, well that's probably just a game mechanic thing. Then why did they put the summon sign there? Like why did they make it possible for Tsorig to fight himself? So if we look at this word from the Knightslayer's ring, where it describes Tsorig as the savage Tsorig. So savage meaning of an animal or force of nature, fierce, violent, and uncontrolled. Cruel and vicious, aggressively hostile, chiefly in historical or literary context, primitive or uncivilized. Of a place, wild-looking and inhospitable, uncultivated. Of something bad or negative, very great or severe. So it seems to me that the version of savage that is being invoked here is the first one, of an animal or force of nature, fierce, violent, and uncontrolled. Or the second one, cruel and vicious, aggressively hostile. So aggressively hostile and so fierce, violent, and uncontrolled is Knightslayer Tsorig that he would see another version of himself from this multiverse, and he would have no problem attacking and killing himself, just like that. So that is, I don't know if that makes any sense, or if anyone has any better ideas of how to explain Tsorig, and not only how to explain Tsorig, but how to explain how Tsorig is so willing, and why Tsorig is so willing to fight himself. Simply because Tsorig is a fierce, violent, and uncontrolled force of nature. I really can't come up with any better explanation for that. But keep this word savage in mind for a minute, because we also have two items in this lava pool here, and because I don't think I'm capable of getting the items in these lava pools and finding my way through the area without having to use a homeward bone, I got these items on another build, and so we won't be getting them here, but we will be reading the description. And in this lava pool here, we have two items. One is an ember, and the other one is sacred flame. The description for which reads, pyromancy taught among savages. Flame burrows inside foes and ignites. Originally used in a ceremony for cleansing sacrificial impurities, thereby lending the spell its name. As barbaric as it seems, this may in fact be quite fitting for the savage pyromancers who consider themselves servants of the divine. So the word savage that's being invoked here in this item description is a little bit different, I think, from the one that was used in the item description for the Knightslayer's ring. And the word as it's being used in this context, it seems to me much more closely approximates this version of savage, which is a noun, and that is being used chiefly in historical or literary contexts, a member of a people regarded as primitive and uncivilized. It could also be used to refer to a brutal or vicious person, but it seems very evident given the context of everything else in the game concerning pyromancers and their relationship to the sorcerers of Vinheim, that what we're looking at here is the first one, so a member of a people regarded as primitive and uncivilized, whereas Knightslayer Tsorig is much closer to a brutal or vicious person, though the way that this word is used in the context of the Knightslayer's ring description is more as an adjective than a noun. But so before we get into this a little bit further, I did want to briefly return to this comment that we addressed in the 3rd episode, which asks, why can't people leave their shitty politics out of games? So if you'll recall in the comment segment for the 3rd episode, I talked about this comment and about how it fails to actually understand that when I am raising and when I am analyzing the political implications of things that I find in the game, I am not grafting politics onto something where it wasn't previously present. I am analyzing the politics that are latent within the game, or that the game itself raises explicitly. And this is one such instance of that in order to properly understand what this item description means, when it says that this is a pyromancy taught among savages, we need to talk about political things. So, just by way of a reminder, this question, why can't people keep their politics out of my games, betrays even the most basic understanding of what politics is, and of how politics are embedded within a game, even if those politics are so normalized to you that you don't recognize them as politics. They are, nevertheless, political. So with all that said, because I'm about to get into some very political things, just a reminder that I'm not grafting something onto the game that isn't there. I am using my knowledge of the things that I'm researching in the process of doing my PhD and my dissertation to perhaps better contextualize what this item description says about the pyromancers of the Great Swamp, their relationship to the sorcerers of Vinheim, and the significance of this item and its description. So just a reminder again that I'm not just bringing this in, that this isn't off-topic stuff. This is stuff that is very much being invoked by the game itself. And I'm going to try and add a little bit of context so that we can all sort of better understand what the game is trying to say when it invokes the term savage to describe these pyromancers. So in order to accomplish that, we're going to look at some slides that I prepared this past fall for my students in trying to help them understand the very same concept. But we're not going to start by talking about the concept of the savage itself, because we need, in order to understand the concept of the savage, we need to understand what it means to not be a savage in the mind of someone who would call someone else a savage, or who would think of another people as a savage people. And that is, we need to understand what it means to be modern, or to live in an age of modernity. I'm going to briefly read an excerpt from a book called We Have Never Been Modern by Bruno Latour. Modernity comes in many versions, yet all its definitions point to the passage of time. The adjective modern designates a new regime, an acceleration, a rupture, a revolution in time. When the word modern, modernization, or modernity appears, we are defining, by contrast, an archaic and stable past. Furthermore, the word is always being thrown into the middle of a fight, in a quarrel where there are winners and losers, ancients and moderns. Modern is thus doubly asymmetrical. It designates a break in the regular passage of time, and it designates a combat in which there are victors and vanquished. So let's unpack that a little bit further, starting first with the contention that modernity designates a break in the regular passage of time. What does this mean? Well, if we look at something like the construction of railroads, we see that before railroads, time and space were different than they were after railroads. Because railways allowed us to go from point A to point B in a much faster time than was ever previously possible, it follows that railways introduced an epistemic break in the regular passage of time. Time was no longer the same after railways became a thing, because time became compressed. It was no longer as much of an obstacle to doing certain things as it was previously. So that's sort of one aspect of what it means to be modern or to live in an age of modernity, that time and space are compressed. And this is doubly true today, because with all this communication technology we have, time and space is virtually nil in some ways of looking at it. That we could be having this conversation, say I was live streaming right now. I could be having a conversation with people from 30 different countries, 40 different countries, like across the entire world. It doesn't really matter. With things like Skype and all these new communication technologies, they all serve to compress space and time. Thus, to live in the modern age is to live in an age of accelerated or compressed time. Latour notes that modernity also designates a combat in which there are victors and vanquished. So, victors and vanquished. This image here, which was illustrated by someone with the Hudson's Bay Company, and I could point out to you who the victors and the vanquished are in this image, but if you look at this image, it's pretty obvious who the victors are and who the vanquished are. So the wealthy white European settlers are all sort of heroically standing there in their fancy garb and holding flags and looking at scrolls and things and looking all heroic and majestic, and the indigenous people are just sort of sitting there meekly. You can tell a lot of what an artist or the person commissioning a piece thinks about the subjects in the piece, at least in my opinion, just based on the stature and how the various subjects of the painting are depicted. And here you can see the indigenous people are sort of just meekly sitting on the ground, whereas the victorious, heroic European settlers are doing victorious, heroic European settlery things. So again, victors and vanquished. If it wasn't clear after that illustration who the victors and who the vanquished were, all you really need to do is look at professional sports in North America. You see a team like the Cleveland Indians, who use this horrifically racist and just absolutely terrible, despicable imagery as that they made an American Indian into their mascot. Chief Wahoo is what this thing is called, and it's despicable. It really is. But it also points to, again, who the victors and who the vanquished are. You don't get much more vanquished than becoming a team's mascot. And this can be seen in various other sports as well. You see the Chicago Blackhawks, the Washington Redskins. It's despicable. And not to belabor the point, but this is another slide I had, which was prepared by the National Congress of American Indians, and just to further accentuate the point I was just making, if we have the Cleveland Indians, why don't we also have teams like the San Francisco Chinamen or the New York Jews with similar caricatures of the team names being depicted on the hats? We don't see that because, again, victors and vanquished. So just to summarize, in terms of victors and vanquished, what do we mean by that? Victors, European settlers, so that is wealthy white men chasing the Enlightenment dream of separating nature from culture, also known as pioneers, explorers, or men of science. The vanquished, indigenous peoples content with understanding nature and culture as inseparable, also known as savages, primitives, and pre-moderns. So the victors and vanquished are separated by what Latour calls the Great Divide. So there are actually two different Great Divides as shown in this diagram here. So the first one is internal, and it's as practiced but denied by the moderns according to Latour, whereby we assume in this first Great Divide, the internal one, that nature and society, nature and culture are separable, that they're separate, that we can dominate nature, that we can make nature serve our needs. And to some extent that's true, but in more cases than not, we find that misunderstanding of how nature and culture works and how they're connected to each other is the reason why large technological engineering projects often fail, because we fail to understand that nature is more complicated than we're able to replicate in the lab. But more important for our purposes is the second Great Divide, the external one. So this Great Divide separates us and them. So us being those of us in the West, and them being those of us who are either not in the West or who are others within the West. So like the indigenous peoples of North America and elsewhere. And we can see that on the other side of the external Great Divide, they conceive of nature and societies, nature and culture, as being inseparable. So this is what Latour calls the pre-modern overlap, as it is seen by the moderns, or those in the West. So another way of thinking about the Great Divide, at least that I've used as a way of wrapping my head around it, is looking at the Wall from A Song of Ice and Fire / Game of Thrones. And you can look at it like they are north of the Wall, the Great Divide, and we, quote unquote, the emphasis I'm placing on them and we there is because I'm doing scare quotes, which you can't actually see, but you could look at the Great Divide as sort of like the Wall. It separates them from us. Indeed, in A Song of Ice and Fire, the White Walkers, as they're called in the television show, are actually called the Others in the books. So making this connection very, very explicit in the books, but unfortunately this was lost when it came to the translation to the TV show because, and this isn't something I'm going to go into in great deal because there are already a million YouTube channels that deal with stuff like this, but at the time Game of Thrones was first being produced, the TV show Lost was still a thing, and there was a faction in the TV show Lost called the Others. So my understanding of it is that they didn't want there to be any confusion between the Others in Lost and the Others in A Song of Ice, or the Others in Game of Thrones specifically, because in the book series in A Song of Ice and Fire they are called the Others. So making that connection very, very explicit. So this is what it looks like when you sort of put it all together. So you have the Great Divide / the Wall, which separates them from us. So them being indigenous peoples, or in the case of the example I was trying to illustrate in this particular lesson, drug users. In the context of Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, wildlings and White Walkers. They are to the north of the Great Divide or the Wall, and underneath it there's us. So the political economic elites of our day, plus their docile citizenry, and in the context of Game of Thrones, A Song of Ice and Fire, the Lords of the Seven Kingdoms and their subservient peasants. So bringing this all back to the Sacred Flame, we can see pretty plainly now that just as was hinted all the way back in Dark Souls 1 about pyromancers being regarded as being rather unsavory, that the pyromancers of the Great Swamp are regarded as pre-modern savages by the sorcerers of Vinheim. That the sorcerers of Vinheim think that they're above not only everyone else, but especially the pyromancers. They are the moderns in this story. They are intent on separating, or on believing that they can separate nature from culture.
Oh, there you are. It's been a while. Or were you just here? This fascinating place defeats my sense of time. The tomes stored in these archives are truly magnificent, a great pool of knowledge, the fruits of superior wisdom and an unquenchable desire for the truth. Some would say Seath had an unsound fixation, but his work is a beautiful, invaluable resource. All progress demands sacrifice, and I certainly bear no antipathy for that wonderful, scaleless beast.
So yeah, it very much does seem that this is what FromSoft was going after. They would not have used the word savages twice in this item description if that's not what they were getting after. And once again, I'm not grafting politics where they don't belong here. I am commenting on the politics that are invoked by the game itself. So I just want to be absolutely clear about that. But okay, moving on. So next up here we have, actually I lied. I said that there was only one, there was a single Black Knight here, but there are actually two Black Knights here. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Black Knights when we get to... Hey friends? When we get to the other Black Knight. Guys, you coming to help? Got a Black Knight here. Oh, they're trapped, okay. There we go. Good job, friends. Oh no, rip. Wow. Well, that... Oh my gosh. Wow. Okay. Good times. So they wouldn't have been able to climb this ladder anyway. So I guess it's not the end of the world that they died there, because we would have had to... Either we would have had to send them home, or, yeah, they wouldn't have been any use to us after this point, because they would have just been stuck down here while we were up there dealing with all the enemies in front of the Ballista. So, yeah. Rip, friends. Okay, so before we ascend this ladder, I should point out that out of curiosity, in trying to think of who or for what, who might have placed this ladder here and for what reason. And based on the number of items which relate here to Dark Souls 2, as well as the fact that we know of a person who, in a later area of the game, builds ladders to find treasure. That is Laddersmith Gilligan. We know that Laddersmith Gilligan was in the world of Dark Souls 3, and may have potentially passed through here on his way to the Profane Capital, where he built tons of ladders. Seemingly, there's really no other explanation for those ladders being there. Not that there has to be, but insofar as there is, it's pretty obvious that Laddersmith Gilligan built those ladders. So out of curiosity, I decided to check what the ladders looked like. And as you may or may not be able to see, there's really no way, like, you can't look at this ladder and say that it looks the same as the ladders that Laddersmith Gilligan built in the Profane Capital, nor, for that matter, can you look at this ladder or the one in the Profane Capital and say that it looks anything similar to the ladders that Laddersmith Gilligan built in Dark Souls 2, or at least those that he built in the to allow you to descend into the pit in Majula in Dark Souls 2. So that doesn't necessarily mean that he didn't build them, because, you know, it's possible that the difference between those things is simply in the materials available and the space in which he's trying to set up ladders. But that does mean that there's no evidence to suggest that he did in fact build these, because, yeah, it's curious. It really is. Unless these ladders were built, because you wouldn't think that whomever built the Ballista would want people to come and, you know, be able to disable it. So, yeah, I really don't know why these ladders are here, other than to allow us to ascend and deactivate the Ballista. So, for gameplay reasons. So we picked up the Dragon Rider bow, the description for which reads, "Longbow of the Dragon Riders, who served the old king of Want. The Dragon Riders were the old king's royal guard, and great strength was demanded of them. Merely drawing this bow calls for inhuman strength. The worthy few who can master this bow, however, use it to devastating effect." So the skill is Puncture, pull the arrow even further back for a more powerful shot that can also pierce shields. So in Dark Souls 2, this soul was made from the Dragon Rider soul, the description for which reads, "Soul of a Dragon Rider who faithfully served King Vendrick. Long ago, the Dragon Riders mounted worms and were feared on the battlefield for their unparalleled strength." So it does note that they have unparalleled strength, but unlike the, say, the Greatsword, which notes that this sword tested the true limits of human strength, and which is somewhat borne out statistically by the 28 strength requirement, and unlike the Fume Ultra Greatsword, which, as we've just learned, is the heaviest of all Ultra Greatswords, and requires 50 strength to wield, the Dragon Rider bow only requires 19 strength. And so that's really curious, because it's just a normal bow that scales with strength, really. But with the disclaimer that I haven't used it in Dark Souls 3, so let's see. It looks a lot like the bow from Dark Souls 2. But what's funny about this bow is that when it was used by the dual Dragon Rider boss in Drang Lake Castle, one of the bosses is using the Dragon Rider halberd, the other one is using a bow. The one that's using the bow, even though it's technically the same bow that we can use, when the Dragon Rider boss uses it, it acts as a great bow. So that is to say, it knocks you down when it hits you. But when the player is using it, it is just a normal bow. It doesn't use great arrows, it doesn't knock people down. So the only explanation I have for that discrepancy in, noting that it requires great strength when it only requires 18 and that, it doesn't really do anything different than other bows, is that somehow in the hands of the Dragon Riders, who are said to be very strong, the bow sort of turns into a great bow. Certainly that's not the most satisfying explanation, but yeah, there is that. This is the spot where I mentioned in the previous episode, I don't know where the other side of this is. I don't know where we can look from Erith Hill / Anor Londo to see this crack in this cave here. But that is something that we are going to look for later on. Feel free to leave a comment if you have some idea of... We're going to lead these guys over here. Yeah, feel free to leave a comment if you have an idea of where that is, and you can just point me to it. But yeah, we can see here the remarkable mechanics of this thing. None of this explains, of course, how it somehow autonomously knows to aim at us and shoot in perpetuity at us until we shut it down. But it is a remarkable piece of machinery. It really is. It's like a clock tower, but yeah, a giant triumvirate ballista. So now that we've shut off the ballista and we've killed the sandworm, notwithstanding the giant crabs down there, we can freely sort of walk around in the Smouldering Lake and talk about things, which is quite nice. Should of course mention the poor giants here, who may have been tasked with bringing this ballista here. We discussed the possibilities for this in the previous episode, so I'm not going to go into this in great length, but they may have brought the ballista here, whether of their own accord or by orders of someone else to do something. We had a number of suggestions earlier in the episode, and I think they're all equally valid. For my part, I don't really know what this was meant to be. One of the suggestions that we talked about in the previous episode is that maybe these giants were intent on using the ballista as a way to tunnel their way or to just make their way to Erith Hill, where many of their compatriots are enslaved. Although these ones are all indications are that these are or were at one point slaves, but I suppose it's possible that they could have freed themselves and hatched a plan to go free their still enslaved compatriots. I don't really know. this place does also... It is also strikingly reminiscent of the arch trees that we see in Dark Souls 1, not only in Ash Lake, but we can also see them from the Tomb of the Giants and from Lost Izalith. So, geographically, that makes sense that we're still seeing them here, insofar as we can make sense of the geography given the converging lands and everything that implies. So yeah, not much else up here beyond that, so let's head down. So that's right where Horace was. Rip Horace. I'm wondering whether it might be worthwhile going to summon Tsorig and Cuculus to help us with this, in the absence of I Help Any Time, who has unfortunately passed. Because he's usually the one helping us with the great crabs, but not today. So I might fast forward this part a little bit, just so that you're not forced to watch me do a terrible job fighting these crabs, because I'm really not good at fighting the great crabs. Yep, Exhibit A. So yeah, like I said. So worthy of note, even though we've already sort of debunked the Ember revealing the summon signs of Unkindled thing, it is nevertheless worthy of note that both of these summon signs you need to be embered in order to summon the phantoms. Because we didn't see it, we didn't see Tsorig's there, we don't see Cuculus' sign here. But now we do. Okay, so that's Cuculus. Might as well summon Tsorig. Yeah, I don't know how you could do this entire area without at least replenishing your Estus once. Oh! I was so confused for a second. I was like, where's Tsorig? I thought maybe there was a consequence to killing him as a hostile NPC. So now that I'm thinking about it a little bit more, I suppose there is some rhyme and reason for Tsorig. That he might not entirely be a violent force of nature, as we discussed earlier. Because you can't... And it's possible that this is, once again, just a gameplay thing, but you can't summon him until such time as you have defeated his invader in the Catacombs of Carthus. And for one reason or another, irrespective of the outcome when he invades you, he teaches you the My Thanks gesture, which is the war cry gesture from Dark Souls 2. So again, perhaps giving us an indication that the earliest point in time that we can verify his existence in the world is Dark Souls 2. Because it is said that he went to Frozen Ilium-Lois, and he... It's not said explicitly, but it's implied that he went to Frozen Ilium-Lois, and that that's where he got the Knightslayer's ring. So, yeah, I don't know why he would all of the sudden decide, okay, this person bested me, in a duel, so I'll drop my summon sign for them. His actions seem much more understandable if you were to assume that he's a member of the Mound Makers, because the things he's doing, they're crazy. They don't make a lot of sense. Because if he is just a rabid animal, why is he dropping a summon sign for us? I don't know. Good job, team. But yeah, whatever the case, it does seem as though, no matter how seemingly rabid Tsorig is, that the Tsorig that we defeated as an invader gains a newfound respect for us, perhaps, and drops his sign for us as an indicator of that respect. But I'm not sold on that at all, really. But yeah, as a team, we're making quick work of these crabs. I'm quite impressed with my little ragtag group here. So, Chaos Gem. This is our first Chaos Gem. A gem of infused titanite, relic of lands scorched by the Chaos Flame, used in infusion to create Chaos weapons. Chaos weapons inflict fire damage and scale with intelligence and faith. So as we noted in the previous episode, the Chaos Gem looks a lot like the Dark Gem, and the Fire Gem looks strikingly like the Deep Gem. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but there you have it. That is something I do want to return to talk about a little bit later on, once we have access to all of the different upgrade materials and infusion gems, so that maybe we could draw like a map or something of how they all relate to each other. I think that could potentially be very interesting and maybe fruitful in aiding our understanding of the story and its mechanics and how those two things relate to each other. So yeah, that appears to be all the crabs. We made really short work of them as a team. Especially keen on doing that by yourself. Yeah, this is a strategy I would very much recommend. I don't know how well this would work in New Game Plus, but in New Game it certainly works quite well. So we're going to head back to the Demon Ruins bonfire, and then we're going to deal with the rest of the area before we go fight the boss. So because the spot where you normally enter the Demon Ruins is over there, and it requires the Ballista to shoot it out, which we didn't do, we are basically going to be doing the area back to front. So this spot right here is very interesting, but we're not going to be able to talk about it just yet until we kill a few of these enemies. So curious that smoldering rotten flesh doesn't seem very interested in attacking Tsorig, because Tsorig was just standing right underneath it and it just ignored him. So obviously it's waiting for the player to try and pick up that item, which is another undead Blanchard, before it attacks. We can see it's a human that is crushed underneath this, or at least it's a generic corpse model, which are generally humans, but squished underneath this demon here. And a spot that looks a lot like these are murals to dead demons. Because as I mentioned earlier, the demons are very much a part, they're fixtures of the landscape here. Dead demons, that is. They are everywhere. They are part of the architecture almost, because there are so many of them and they're present everywhere. But this is something else. Again, the question of the candles, who keeps the candles lit? I don't know, and I don't know that that question can be answered. But this is a sign, if it wasn't already obvious, that the demons, they had culture. They weren't just demons. You know, I'm gonna kill you, and like, they're not just demons. They're demons, but they're more than that. And I think that that is fascinating. Did you guys not kill this? Whoa! What the hell happened here? What did you guys do? Oh, whoa! What? Okay, I think that corpse was supposed to ragdoll, but it didn't. Or it's not supposed to ragdoll, but it did. Which, yeah, caused whatever the heck that was. So yeah, so that's the demons. So right now we're sort of at the middle point of the area, at least as best as I understand. I don't understand this area very well. I get very confused by it. So we're going to go this way, and then we're going to go that way and deal with all the illusory walls that we skipped earlier. Guys, relax, relax, it's okay. So yeah. A nice little storytelling set piece here, which tells us something that we already knew about the Black Knights. And that is that they, as Black Knights and Silver Knights, one of their sworn enemies was the demons of Izalith. The demons that were created when the Witch of Izalith attempted to recreate, not to simply relight, but to recreate the first flame. She tried to make a new first flame. and that backfired spectacularly, produced the bed of chaos, out of which sprung the demons.
My mother, the Witch of Izalith, was one of the primeval lords. Her power came from the soul that she found near the first flame. She focused this power to light a flame of her own. But she failed to control it. The flame of chaos engulfed Mother and my sisters and molded them into deformed creatures. Only I escaped. And now I am here. But my mother and sisters have been in anguish since. I beseech you, free Mother and my sisters from the flame of chaos. I cannot do it myself. I lack the strength and the bravery. But you, I realize what I am asking. But please, free their poor souls. Mother's ambitions were misguided, no doubt. But surely 1,000 years of atonement is enough.
And we pick up off of a corpse here the Black Knight's sword, the description for which reads, great sword wielded by the Black Knights who wander the lands, designed to face chaos demons. The unique attack of this sword greatly reduces enemy poise, reflecting the tremendous size of the enemies that the knights have fearlessly faced. Skill, Perseverance, raise sword in the name of the First Lord to temporarily boost poise, damage reduced while activated. So if we turn to our next fun with definitions, we find that perseverance means steadfastness in doing something despite difficulty or delay in achieving success. So I guess you could look at this and say, yeah, they didn't exactly succeed in eliminating the demons, but judging by the presence of 2 Black Knights here, and by the death of the demons, even though the Black Knights were not necessarily directly responsible for exterminating the demons, there was a delay in achieving that success, no matter how it actually came to be. So, yeah, it's interesting that the skill of the weapon, as in many cases in this game, says something about the story and says something about the item description, in addition to just simply giving you gameplay heads up about something or other. So yeah, I'm not sure that I have much more to say about it than that. When we first came across the first Black Knight in the game, which is in the Crucifixion Woods, I said a great deal about the Black Knights and what they were supposed to be in Dark Souls 1 and how, to some extent in Dark Souls 3, they realized that, but not fully. Something else I did want to note about this, can't really see him, and I don't want to get too close for fear of aggroing the enemy, but that right there is one of the Bastard Gru. And the reason I say that is that they have, I think it's half the HP of the other Gru. And so in the back of the guide in the bestiary, it mentions their name, Bastard Gru, and it gives their HP, which is half of that of the other Gru. So again, insofar as that means these are Gru that are unwanted, so Bastard meaning Otoshigo, they're unwanted, it kind of makes sense when you look at who they are compared to the other Gru, who aren't in the greatest shape themselves, but they're a tad stronger, and they walk like humans instead of walking on all fours like beasts, like the Bastard Gru. So let's see how much HP they have. 465. Oh, Tsorig, you gotta heal up, buddy. Tsorig is not in great shape. Don't you have Estus? So again, just piles and piles of bodies here. Something that I've not mentioned, which I suppose I should, is that the entire area is basically embered. And insofar as we look at embers and kindling as indicating Yeah, so this Grue here has something like 900 HP, which is basically twice that of the Bastard Grue. So the Grue that are on all fours are the Bastard Grue. This is a Conjurator Grue. And this is just a normal Grue. Or in this case, a Smouldering Grue. And here we find the first bonfire of the area. We find another Conjurator Grue. Flanked by Grue on either side as well. So it would be nice to be able to angle. Okay, never mind. There goes Tsorig. I don't know how Tsorig is still alive at this point. Honestly. So we have another demon here, what looks like a demon cleric. Once again with the exact same growths coming out of it as the one that we came across earlier. But this one has the Izalith Pyromancy Tome. The description for which reads, a pyromancy tome from Izalith containing pyromancies of the witches. Give to the old master pyromancer to learn chaos pyromancies of Izalith. Chaos pyromancies manipulate lava and birth all later forms of pyromancy. And this right here is where we would have fallen in had we allowed the Ballista to shoot out that that pile of bricks from above. And so Chaos Gem there sort of indicating it was just a crystal lizard. You don't need to waste your poison on crystal lizards, friend. A Chaos Gem there indicating what we learned when we read the Chaos Gem that we picked up in the lake itself. And we're going to run down this hallway here, avoiding all of the smoldering rotten flesh in the process, and hopefully we can get beautiful. Hopefully we can get them to ignore, because I have a feeling Tsorig is not long for our world. Come on, friends, let's go, let's go. No, Tsorig. Who would have thought Cuculus with like no armor would have outlasted Tsorig? Okay, so we got an Estus shard now. Hopefully we can get Cuculus to ignore them. Beautiful. Okay, so that is more or less the first part of the area. So now if we return over here, we find another lava pit, and there are a couple items down there that we're going to talk about in a second. Hopefully Cuculus doesn't fall down there. So I mentioned earlier that this right here is an illusory wall. That is a spider that looks a lot like the non-human portion of the fair lady, Quelan, or Quelan. I always interpret Q-U-E as being a K sound because people from Quebec pronounce it Quebec, so that's how I try to do it. But elsewhere in Canada, it's Quebec, and so that's sort of transferred over to my pronunciation of Quelaag and Quelan, who everyone else refers to as Quelaag and Quelan, but that sounds weird to me because, yeah, of the Quebec thing. So you can interpret this in several different ways. One being that the item that we pick up from this thing is someone who died next to the corpse of Quelan, insofar as we're going to accept that this corpse is that of Quelan, the fair lady from Dark Souls 1. Another possibility is that the corpse is meant to represent the human part of Quelan, that we're seeing here just the spider part of Quelan's body, and that the human part represents the human torso that she had. And it's the Quelana Pyromancy Tome. So when we meet Quelana in Dark Souls 1, and she is one of the daughters of Izalith, the Witches of Chaos. When we meet her, she has a very human-like form. She doesn't really seem like a god at all. She just looks like any regular NPC. Notwithstanding the fact that we can't see her until certain conditions are met. But, yeah, so it could also just be that Quelana came and died along with her sister. But of course this place looks nothing like the spot where we meet the Fair Lady in Dark Souls 1. So again, it's hard to say with the lands converging thing, whether or not we're supposed to accept this as the same spot, or whether in some way, shape, or form these things were transported along with the converging lands to a new spot. But yeah, let's look at the item description. A Pyromancy Tome of Quelana containing her unique spells. These pyromancies can only be taught by a female. Give to a female pyromancy master to learn Quelana's pyromancies. Quelana, the sole surviving witch of Izalith, once accepted a human pupil, but after the pupil moved on, she never took another. So this is something that I find slightly confusing in light of the fact that in Dark Souls 1...
Long ago, I accepted another pupil like yourself. Over 200 years ago, there was a man almost as bungling as you. In your world, he was called Salaman, the Master Pyromancer. The little rascal really made something of himself.
We would be the second pupil that she ever accepted. So this could be taken to mean that in the canonical story of Dark Souls 1, the chosen undead never learns pyromancies from Quelana. That's the best way I can explain this. But the other way is simply that, again, potentially historical forgetting, potentially the developers forgetting. But whatever the case, it is said that she only ever had one human pupil.
Outstanding. You have done very well. Thank you. I am blessed to have met you. I suppose I can call you fool no longer. I can hardly thank you enough. Please take this. It is all of me. Ah, very well. There is nothing left for me to teach you. Our time together is done. It was short, but sweet.
So in this pool of lava down here, there are several items, in addition to a couple of smoldering rotten flesh enemies. But again, in the interest of preserving my Estus, I got the items on another build, and we won't be getting them right now, but I do have the item descriptions here. The first of which is the White Hair Talisman. Talisman made from a lock of white hair. This lock of hair belonged to a deformed member of the Chaos Witches, mothers of the art of pyromancy. Fashioned into a talisman, it enables the wielder to cast both miracles and pyromancies. Skill, Combustion, creates a powerful flame in the wielder's hand, one of the most basic pyromancies, and for this very reason the flame created is fierce, works while equipped in either hand. Oh, speaking of the smoldering rotten flesh, they're coming for us, so we better get out of here before Cuculus aggroes onto them. No, Cuculus, friend, over here. Thank you. Okay. And so that tells us a little bit more about Caelon, about the Fair Lady, that she was a deformed member of the Chaos Witches. And there was another deformed character that we met in Dark Souls 1 named Engi, who we mentioned in the previous episode, and he's mentioned in the item description for Toxic Mist, which reads, unique pyromancy of Engi that never gained currency in the Great Swamp, creates an intense poison mist. Driven from the Great Swamp, they say that at the end of his journey, Engi happened upon a virulent poison and a young lady. So if we turn to our next fun with definitions, we find that virulent means of a disease or poison extremely severe or harmful in its effects, of a pathogen, especially a virus, highly infective, and also bitterly hostile. So the one that's being referred to is obviously the first one as an adjective of a disease or poison, something that's extremely severe or harmful in its effects. If I recall correctly, the story of Engi and the Fair Lady in Dark Souls 1, that the Fair Lady sacrificed herself. She consumed what I believe was called the Blight Pus.
Worse than undead, we are diseased and unwanted, like the grime of the Great Swamp. But my dear Fair Lady, she cried for me and swallowed the great Blight Pus, despite Mistress Quelag's orders to the contrary.
And Caelon, the Fair Lady, feeling sympathetic to those who were suffering from the Blight Pus, she took it upon herself to consume it, to take it in herself, and suffered immeasurably as a result, which gave rise to the Daughters of Chaos Covenant. The idea underlying the Covenant is that these are all people who are devoted to the Fair Lady, who herself showed great care, great kindness, great devotion in taking the Blight Pus into herself, sacrificing herself for the good of those in the area. Recall also that in the previous episode, Mitch and I discussed the Witch's Ring, which has a similar name to the Old Witch's Ring in Dark Souls 1, but the Old Witch's Ring looks different, has a different icon. The Old Witch's Ring was used to speak with Caelon, the Fair Lady, and this is what that looks like.
Quelag, my dear sister. Quelag, what is it? Quelag, my dear sister, the eggs, it hurts. They've gone still. I am afraid it may be too late. I am so sorry, dear sister. I'll be fine. I have you, dear sister. But promise me that you will take care of yourself. Enter a covenant again, of course. Let me try. Quelag, please, sister, do not cry. I am happy, really. I have you, don't I?
But as Mitch noted in the previous episode, this isn't the same ring as the Old Witch's Ring from Dark Souls 1. Or at least it uses the icon for the orange charred ring from Dark Souls 1, or an approximation of it. It looks a little bit different. In Dark Souls 1, the ring part itself was a little bit darker, and the jewel in the middle had a little bit more of an orange tint to it. But in any case, the description read, "An orange ring enchanted by a witch reduces lava damage. Since his sores were inflamed by lava from birth, his witch sisters gave him this special ring, but fool that he is, he readily dropped it, and from that spot a terrible centipede demon was born." So again, notwithstanding the fact that the witches of Izalith are gods, basically, they're not inconsequential humans. They're very significant in the world of Dark Souls, starting with Dark Souls 1, but their stories are very, very human. Recall earlier when we were talking about what you might describe as techno-scientific hubris, that of the West, where we understand, or we think we understand nature and culture as being inseparable, and as a consequence of that assumption, we ignore the complexity underlying our understandings of nature, refracted as they are through our cultural understandings of the world as well. So if we ignore the impact of our culture in our understanding and how it impacts our understanding of the world, then we are doing ourselves a disservice in not fully being honest with ourselves about the reasons why we believe the things we do. And in the case of the Witch of Izalith, she attempted to recreate the first flame. She thought that she would be able to solve the problem of the fading flame by making a new one. Make a new first flame, why not? We can do all these other great things. And obviously it backfired spectacularly. In so doing, it deformed many of the witches of Izalith, the Daughters of Chaos, including the one non-female member of the family, the brother who we come to know as Ceaseless Discharge, whose sisters made him a ring which would help soothe the pain that he felt in his feet when stepping in the lava. And he dropped it. And we find him in a very sorry state as a result, where he's grieving over the corpse of what he thinks is his dead sister, or what may be one of his dead sisters that we don't know of. The armor set that we picked up, the gold hem set, is said to belong to Quelana, but we meet Quelana later on and she's fine. But yeah, he drops the ring, and that gives birth to the Centipede Demon, who we later have to fight in order to get the ring so that we can walk on the lava and traverse Lost Izalith and go to destroy the Bed of Chaos. The only alternative to that is if we give enough humanity to the Fair Lady such that she gets better to the point where she's well enough, and for some reason that grants us passage to a back entrance to Izalith where we don't have to traverse the lava. There are a number of ways you can go about it, but the point I'm trying to make is basically that it's a very human story, that of the Witches of Izalith and all the tragedies that ensue, with Quelana being left the only non-deformed member of her family.
The Witch of Izalith. Please, do not speak of her. I abandoned my mother and sisters and fled to this land. Now I roam these parts, feigning ablution and pretending to seek answers.
Okay, so in order to complete Great Swamp Cuculus's quest, she needs to survive the boss fight. So it is kind of curious that I think this is the only quest in the game that follows that Dark Souls 2 way of doing things, where in Dark Souls 2, if you were shepherding an NPC along on their quest line, you would have to ensure that they survived a certain number of boss fights in order to proceed to the next spot of their quest. And Cuculus, yeah, that applies only in this one instance in this game, so it's curious that that is the case. So I wasn't sure whether or not we would summon Tsorig, but I figured we might as well. It'll be one more source of aggro for the boss to focus on. It might take longer to kill the boss, but I also don't want to kill the boss too quickly, so that we can have a look at some of its moves and, you know, enjoy the music, things like that. So all the usual stuff. So our goal is to keep Cuculus alive. So that was far, far easier than I was expecting it would be. But yeah, pretty interesting boss fight, especially the last part there. When the boss gets down to a certain level of HP, it suddenly loses its flame. It loses the chaos. So mirroring the rest of this area. So recall that smolder, the definition for smolder, is to burn slowly with smoke but no flame, to show or feel barely suppressed anger, hatred, or another powerful emotion, or to exist in a suppressed or concealed state, or smoke coming from a fire that is burning slowly without a flame. So, to burn slowly with smoke but no flame would seem to describe the old Demon King. There was smoke there, but there was no fire. Metaphorically speaking, I guess, because there was fire, obviously, it was hurting us with the fire attacks, but once it got to a certain point of the boss fight, it was clear the chaos is dead, and the old Demon King was clinging to the last remnants of it. We picked up the soul of the old Demon King, one of the twisted souls steeped in strength, used to acquire many souls or transposed to extract its true strength. The shriveled old Demon King is now like a clump of burnt ash, but he is the last living witness of the chaos of Izalith. So we can get one of two items from this soul. The first being the old King's Great Hammer. Great Hammer of the old Demon King. This weapon has survived since old Izalith and is imbued with remnants of the Chaos Flame. Skill, Molten Perseverance. Anchor weapon in earth to temporarily boost poise and use strong attack to repeatedly stab earth to trigger molten explosions. So that's the attack that we saw where the old Demon King was summoning fireballs from the sky. And it was very curious because during the boss fight I was trying to angle my camera upwards, but the game wouldn't allow me to. So that suggests to me that maybe there's something about how the projectiles are summoned into the world that doesn't look very good. So, but it's possible I was just doing something weird there, but it was very strange. It was like there was a ceiling on top of us and I couldn't angle my camera any higher. But yeah. The second item we can get is called Chaos Bed Vestiges. Traces of the tumultuous seedbed that birthed the beings known as demons. Hurls chaos flame that scorches vicinity. Demons born from fire bore its smoldering essence and perished soon after. Man shares this rapport with the flames to this day. So this item, of course, was first introduced in Dark Souls 2, where it was called Forbidden Sun, and the description read, Pyromancy developed in Aldean rites, fires a giant fireball with a widely encompassing explosion. What could possibly justify such excessive destructive power? In all likelihood, the madmen of Aldea never even questioned the need. So the invocation of Aldea as sort of a location there is not something I really understand. I do seem to recall there being an answer to why that is, but I can't remember what that was. But in any case, it's not terribly surprising given the state that we find Aldea in Scholar of the First Sin, Pulse version 1.1, that Aldea is basically a physical manifestation of chaos. But yeah, but it's interesting that they renamed it in Dark Souls 3 to Chaos Bed Vestiges, which I suppose is a more concise way of communicating what that item description was getting at by indirectly referring to Aldea, who we later learned, because Forbidden Sun was in the base game and Aldea wasn't, but we later learned that yeah, Aldea is basically the physical manifestation of chaos. So I'm not really sure that I have much more to add to all this than that, other than, yeah, that's the Smouldering Lake. There are dead demons everywhere. The demons are no more, the chaos is no more, but there's still a trace of it. A very, very small trace of it that we saw in the boss fight, but for the most part, it's done. It's over. Okay, so we now need to finish off Great Swamp Cuculus' questline. And in order to do that, we need to come up here. Where we find a corpse. Next to where we initially found Cornyx. And it contains Cornyx's set and the spotted whip. So description for the spotted whip reads, whip mottled with venomous-looking spots, favored by some female pyromancers of the Great Swamp. As its noxious appearance would suggest, damage from this whip poisons its victims, slowly but surely guiding them to their deaths. Strike from the left to evade shields and deal a stinging blow that temporarily slows stamina recovery. The shackles of bondage lie deep in the hearts of all humankind. Attire of Cornyx, pyromancer of the Great Swamp. In the Great Swamp, it was customary to adorn oneself with articles of nature. Cornyx favored the use of raven feathers. Ravens are said to have once been Firelink messengers, guiding the undead to the land of the ancient gods. So that would seem to be a reference to the raven, or what I once thought was a crow, but I guess the raven that carries you from the Northern Undead Asylum to Firelink Shrine. And then later carries you back from Firelink Shrine to the Northern Undead Asylum. But I'm not sure what its significance is in the context of this item description. For Cornyx's wrap, the description reads, attire of Cornyx, pyromancer of the Great Swamp. The bronze ornamentation serves to ward off evil spirits. And Cornyx's skirt says, this long skirt emulates those worn by witches who were the forebears of pyromancy. So we can see once again, as we explored at great length earlier, all of this stuff about folk wisdom and superstition and whatnot, these are all things that, in the context of the traditional knowledge of local indigenous communities, that someone from, say, Vinheim would look at and they would think that it's stupid and silly and, oh, it's not scientific. But just because they're not what we imagine science or medicine to look like doesn't necessarily mean that they're not effective or that they don't accomplish their stated goal within the context in which they're used. Cornyx is still around, so he must be doing something right. Irrespective of how effective his bronze ornamentation is to ward off evil spirits, he's still around. You could also look at the bronze ornamentation as perhaps a callback, much like the skirt, to the Witches of Izalith, because their sets were referred to as the Gold Hem set in Dark Souls 1. So I don't know if bronze is really a direct reference, but yeah, it's a thing. So the second question is, what the heck happened here? So I have elsewhere, I don't know where, but I have elsewhere talked about what my interpretation of this storyline is. And as far as I'm concerned, what seems to have happened here is that for one reason or another, Cuculus locked Cornyx in this cage here. Cuculus was seemingly Cornyx's apprentice at some point, because if you look at the character models, Cuculus is, I believe, either created using the youthful model or the middle-aged model. In terms of, I'm not sure if it affects the model as much as it does the voices, or if it's both, but whatever the case, she looks very young, and Cornyx does not. So Cornyx was, in my view, very obviously the master in the master-apprentice relationship between the two of them. So it would seem that at some point, Cuculus, for whatever reason, decided that Cornyx needed to be locked up. Or perhaps Cornyx got locked up and she was off trying to find a key. But then we came along and Cornyx decided, oh, well, I'll just go with you because, you know, my apprentice locked me up, or she abandoned me, whatever the case is. She left him here and then came back and found that he wasn't here. And that seems to have made her go hollow. The reason why she came back, and I think this works whether or not they parted on good terms or not. So whether she locked him in here or she was off trying to rescue him, trying to find a key to rescue him, I think she came back because she was so excited to share with him, hey, I found Izalith. I found the birthplace of pyromancy. How cool is that? And then she found that he wasn't here, and so she just sort of went hollow and died. And dropped her set, which is also Cornyx's set, and the Spotted Whip. So if anyone else has any better explanation for that, I would be, or more fleshed out explanation for that, I'd be very interested in hearing it. Because that's pretty much all I have, except for one thing, and that is the name Cuculus. So Cuculus, and this is per Wikipedia, is a genus of cuckoos which has representatives in most of the Old World, although the greatest diversity is in tropical southern and southeastern Asia. Cuculus cuckoos are brood parasites, that is, they lay a single egg in the nests of various passerine hosts. The best known example is the European common cuckoo. The female cuckoo in each case replaces one of the host's eggs with her own. The cuckoo egg hatches earlier than the host, and the chick grows faster. In most cases, the cuckoo chick evicts the eggs or young of the host species. Cuculus species lay colored eggs to match those of their passerine hosts. Female cuckoos specialize in a particular host species, generally the species that raise them, and lay eggs that closely resemble the eggs of that host. But yeah, that's the reference seemingly with her name. I don't know how it fits into the story though.
Ah, there you are, unkindled one. I am pleased to have a pupil as dedicated as you.
So I think we're going to buy all the pyromancies that we have not yet purchased, so that we know which ones we've just unlocked.
Ah, what have we here? A pyromancy tome from Izalith. Then you found the home of pyromancy. Brilliant! I will never curse being old and undead again. Now, show it here, quickly. Let us channel them together. The primal pyromancies known only to old Master Salaman.
So there's that reference to Salaman again, the only human pupil of Quelana, of Izalith. And again, I suspect that that is the reaction that he would have had Cuculus returned and had she found him in the cage. Like, oh my gosh, really? You found Izalith? No. But yeah, unfortunately, we are the ones who, well, depending on how you look at it, unfortunately for Cuculus, we're the ones who get to deliver the good news to Cornyx. So this unlocks Great Chaos Fire Orb. Art of the Flame of Chaos from Ancient Izalith hurls a Great Chaos Fire Orb. Chaotic flame melts even great boulders and creates a brief surge of molten lava on impact. The Witch of Izalith and her daughters birthed the Flame of Chaos, but it devoured them along with their home. So molten, meaning especially of materials with a high melting point such as metal and glass, liquefied by heat, and lava meaning hot molten or semi-fluid rock erupted from a volcano or fissure, or solid rock resulting from the cooling of this. And then we also have Chaos Storm. Art of the Flame of Chaos from Ancient Izalith erects multiple chaos fire pillars in vicinity. Chaotic flame melts even great boulders and creates a brief surge of molten lava on impact. The all-engulfing chaos flame eventually formed a tumultuous seedbed, which gave birth to the twisted things known as demons. So tumultuous seedbed meaning making a loud, confused noise or uproarious, excited, confused, or disorderly for tumultuous, and seedbed a bed of fine soil in which seedlings are germinated. So the bed of chaos was a disorderly bed of fine soil in which demons were germinated. So yeah, it was just those two that we learned indirectly through Salaman.
Ah, what have we here? By the gods, this inscription reads, Quelana, the ancient deity, one of the witches of Izalith. The last of them who wandered the lands. Then she must have returned to Izalith after all. But I regret to say, I cannot accept this. Quelana's pyromancies are for witches and must be learned from a mistress. But thank you for allowing me to peer upon such a thing. If only I were a woman. Huh.
And if we try to give him the Grave Warden Pyromancy Tome?
I'm afraid I cannot accept this. This pyromancy tome is dark and delves into the depths of men where an untouchable flame resides. I cannot comprehend this myself, let alone teach it to you. It is a spell forbidden in the Great Swamp, and nearly everywhere else too. Only one terribly afflicted or burdened by deep sorrow could begin to understand this.
So we got that dialogue in the previous episode, but just by way of a reminder. So let's see if he has any new dialogue in light of us having given him all these tomes.
Heed my words, unkindled one. Fear the fire. The home of pyromancy, Izalith, was scorched by the very fire it created. Undoubtedly, it was a flame of chaos, tangled by a witch's hand. But who's to say that this bonfire's flame is any different?
Pyromancy is the art of invoking and manipulating fire. But remember one thing. Always fear the flame, lest you be devoured by it and lose yourself. I would hate to see that happen again.
Do not be gone for long. What is a teacher without a pupil?
Oh man, if I wasn't already so set in doing the exit greeting that I do in every episode, that would be a good line to end each episode on. What is a teacher without a pupil? Bye-bye. Doesn't quite have the same ring to it though. So yeah, I guess not a lot more to say about Cornyx for now. But I am interested in hearing what each of you think about all the things that we've discussed in this episode up to this point.
Speak thy desire, honorable Lord of Hollows. Our lord and liege, knowest thou of a maid named Anne-Marie? She is hollow, and will join thee in wedlock. A fellow of mine guides her at this moment. When the time is ripe, thou mayst make thy salutations. For what lord taketh no spouse?
So yeah, just to reiterate the comment we read out from Gummo5555 earlier in the episode, Yuria mentions that a fellow of hers is guiding Henri at the moment. So that would seem to be the likeliest explanation as to how Henri and Horace got separated. Henri says that she fell for a trap, but it seems that insofar as the trap was hatched by someone specifically, that it would have been the Pilgrim of Londor that is currently guiding Henri.
Till we meet again, may the dark sigil guide thee.
So that's something that we're not going to deal with just yet. In the next 2 or 3 episodes we will, of course. But before we get to the comments, I guess I should probably give you guys a closer look at what Aegon is going through right now. He does not look good. Not in the slightest. And this is hollowing. This isn't even full hollowing. This is only 25 of 99. So the Dark Sigil is having a very serious effect on us. Whatever it is that is leaking, the pus presumably, that is leaking out of us, is leaving us in a very sorry state. I don't even know how to describe it, because yeah, it's certainly not, it's not a dermatologist's vision of healthy skin, I wouldn't imagine. But yeah, so we will return to that, but for now, just note that, yeah, unfortunately Aegon's going through a bit of a hard time, which is why he's concealed his face a little bit. He's a little bit self-conscious of how he looks at the moment. So I think that's everything. I feel like with the amount of time I spent preparing for this episode, and then the gap in between the preparation and the actual recording of this episode, I feel like I've missed a ton of things. But we have actually covered a lot in this episode, so I think I'm going to leave it at that for now, and then if anyone can think of anything that I might have missed in the process of, you know, everything that has happened in this episode, don't hesitate to let me know, and I'll do my best to see if we can cover it in the next episode, where we'll be going to Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. So you can also feel free to leave comments relating to the first half, or Irithyll more generally, in the comment section to this episode, and I'll see whether or not I can use them in a similar way to the comments that I use for this episode, where I use them as a way of guiding our exploration of the area, instead of simply being an addendum to the episode itself at the comment segment at the end. But we do have some comments to get through in this addendum now, so let's get to that. So, as always, you all have to accept my sincerest apologies if I don't read your comment in this episode. There were many great comments, as there always are, and unfortunately we just don't have the time to read them all. I would love to, but we just don't have the time. Ty Bud writes, in this link, a guy says that from the Japanese translation, Ludleth clearly says he's a pygmy or refers to himself as a pygmy. So Ty Bud goes on to ask a question, but we'll return to the question in a minute. Let's have a look at this Reddit post first. So it's titled, Ludleth says he is a pygmy in Japanese plus more, by Reddit user Wespy. So I will leave a link to the full Reddit post in the video description below, and I would encourage you all to check it out, because I'm not going to, as usual, I'm not going to recapitulate the post in full. So Westby writes, Ludleth clearly states in Japanese that he is a pygmy, or at least refers to himself as one. The Japanese never reads, I may be small but I will die a colossus. And the famous line is actually in past tense and much more simple. He instead says, even this pygmy here was honored to become a lord. The Japanese word kobito, edit actually shojin, was translated as pygmy since Dark Souls 1. It can mean dwarf, pygmy, small person, elf even, but is more generalized due to the nature of the kanji, meaning simply small person. To be clear, the Japanese does not make the shonen sound magical or non-human. Furtive pygmy is more accurately yet blandly translated as the small person who nobody knows. Although both translations can mean the same thing, the capitalization of the adjective furtive as well as pygmy has two nuanced effects. It distinguishes him as overly unique and distances him genetically, or essentially, from humans, which is not exactly the case in Japanese. Reading Japanese forums a bit, it seems that nobody doubts Ludleth is a pygmy. But rather the question at hand is whether or not he himself is the first pygmy, the small person that nobody knows, or the furtive pygmy. Of course, not all seem to agree with this, since the goals of Ludleth and the furtive pygmy seem to be polar opposites, making it unlikely. However, if he was branded with the curse and dark sign, wouldn't he seek fire like all his descendants? So I'm obviously lacking in the expertise necessary to assess Wespy's post and to comment on its validity in terms of the translation, but what I will say is that this seems to make a lot of sense, and it seems consistent with everything else that we know. In terms of the line where he states in English that he may be small but he will die a colossus, Yosaho translated this line to this tiny man taken an honor of the king. So essentially meaning the same thing that Wespy said it did. notwithstanding the tiny man versus furtive, which again, I don't really have the expertise necessary to say who's right, who's wrong, or whether there's nuance here that I'm just not seeing. For the record, in terms of the English word furtive meaning as an adjective, attempting to avoid notice or attention, typically because of guilt or a belief that discovery would lead to trouble. Secretive, suggestive of guilty nervousness. And pygmy referring as a noun to a member of certain peoples of very short stature in equatorial Africa and parts of Southeast Asia, as a derogatory term for a very small person, animal, or thing, or also derogatory as an insignificant person, especially one who is deficient in a particular respect. As an adjective, it's used in names of animals and plants that are much smaller than more typical kinds. But in this case, it's obviously being used as a noun, furtive, pygmy, adjective, noun. So in returning to Tybud's question, my question is, does that mean the area where you get the Chloranthy ring +3, he's the one getting the crown placed on his head? So I think the answer to this question would depend on whether or not you think that Ludleth is the furtive pygmy, which I don't think there's any reason to believe that he is. I really don't, because if you think of the others who found the Lord Souls in the flame, they're all gone. They're all long gone. I don't see it as being likely that the furtive pygmy has somehow lasted all this time. But with that said, the furtive pygmy is the only one to have left a lineage, a legacy, in the form of the Ring City. And obviously, at the point in time when we visit it, things are not looking good. But in returning again to Tybud's question, is Ludleth the pygmy who's receiving a crown but is symbolically being granted a lordship? Is that Ludleth? So it's obviously a separate question as to whether or not that's the furtive pygmy or whether it's just a pygmy that's meant as a stand-in for the pygmy people in general. I would lean towards the former just because it's simpler, but the latter also works, I guess. But in either case, I don't think it's Ludleth. But that's just me. I do think it makes a lot of sense that Ludleth is a pygmy, makes a heck of a lot of sense. And especially when you consider the fact that the pygmies that we find in the Ring City, they all have mobility issues similar to Ludleth, and that is a very polite way of saying that Ludleth doesn't have a lower half. And none of the pygmies that we meet in the Ring City have lower halves. They all sort of crawl to get to where they need to go, or they're just sitting there and we happen upon them. So yeah, Ludleth is very obviously a pygmy. But yeah, it's just interesting to see this as being something that apparently has been the translation all along, but only in light of the Ring City did it become so blatantly obvious that we have to look at it and go, oh gosh, that was there all along. So yeah, thank you Tybud for bringing this to my attention. Willem of Latria writes, an excerpt from the Exile set reads, within the wood, an emaciated old wolf commands watchdogs to defend the sanctity of sleeping warriors. So the old wolf is alive, but just barely. To which I replied, interesting. If only the hosts of this series had a segment dedicated to exploring the definition of words like emaciated, we might have caught this. Oh, wait. I felt really silly by that one, but unfortunately, even with this episode, I prepared more fun with definitions segments than we ended up using. And there were always choices that need to be made, but in this case, it's just a shame that one that I chose not to do a fun with definition segment for was one that would have much more easily addressed this point from the previous episode, so I thank you, Willem of Latria, for bringing this up. So just for the record, emaciated means abnormally thin or weak, especially because of illness or a lack of food. So she was so emaciated she could hardly stand. So yeah, I guess the old Wolf of Farron is just barely clinging to life, even though, you know, it's weird that we can't hit it or anything like that, so I'm not entirely sure. Rick Fasten writes, the fight with the Abyss Watchers actually glitched in my game, and a Dark Wraith did get through the fog wall. I thought it was part of the fight, and he, the Abyss Watchers, and the Red-Eyed Watcher all fought each other. What I found remarkable was that the Dark Wraith did insane damage. With one hit, he took about 1/5 of the boss's health. So I don't know what to make of that last part about the Dark Wraith doing an insane amount of damage. That's interesting, but the first phase of the boss fight isn't really, like, the boss doesn't really have a heck of a lot of HP, and the Dark Wraiths are pretty nasty in and of themselves, so I don't think that is really that beyond the pale. But I do thank you for bringing this up, Rick, because yeah, it's very interesting. It's something I was speculating about in an earlier episode, about whether whether or not, why don't they actually do something when they get there? But it's funny that it is possible, but only through a glitch in the game, so I'm not really sure. Commander Biggles writes, as an archaeology student, the catacombs of Carthus remind me of a cross between traditional catacombs and ossuaries, where bones were displayed in strange artistic forms. See the skeletons as decorative features on the pillars. A famous example of this is Sedlec Ossuary in Prague, which is about as extravagant as you can get, but aptly shows the use of skeletons for decorative purposes. And that is, yeah, a very striking image. Commander Biggles goes on to write, as for the overall layout of the catacombs, they are, especially on the upper levels, much wider than those usually found in real life. For instance, the catacombs of Priscilla in Rome. Imagine trying to fight enemies in an environment like that. Luckily, common sense prevailed at FromSoft headquarters. So something that I mentioned to Mitch in the previous episode, but that I eventually cut out anyway, was that when I went to Rome back in, it would have been back in 2009, summer 2009, so I don't know whether it was the catacombs of Priscilla, but I was staying in Rome and I visited some catacombs not far from where I was staying. So if I recall correctly, photographs inside of the catacombs were forbidden or something like that, or it could have just been the fact that, as you can see from this really, really low quality photo of me standing outside of the catacombs, I was using a disposable camera, believe it or not, and so I imagine that if photos were permitted, the camera I had probably wouldn't have been good enough to pick anything up. But I remember it being exactly like this photo provided by Commander Biggles, which really does a good job of capturing how claustrophobic that place can make you feel, even if you're not the type of person to generally feel claustrophobic. So I just thought I would bring this up because that is, something I mentioned in the previous episode, but that ended up getting cut out, is that I've actually been to catacombs in real life, and it was somewhat frightening, but also, very interesting. So to echo Commander Biggles' sentiment here, it's certainly a good thing that FromSoft decided to take some liberties with their design of the catacombs in their video games. Commander Biggles goes on to write, the multiple levels and bridges in the catacombs implied to me an intention to recreate the idea of a Greek necropolis, city of the dead. Although these were nearly always above ground, they did still resemble cities in a way, with streets and temples to perform sacred rites. What I'm trying to get at is that the catacombs of Carthus are a great combination of many different burial traditions, so well done FromSoft for combining features into their own unique style. Very well said. Thank you very much for bringing your knowledge to bear on that area. I really do appreciate it. Sleepy Esper writes, I initially thought that Elfrida was the guest mentioned in the Black Blade. Now an outcast of Londor, being unkindled ash, she and Wilhelm wandered across the world until they came across the painted world of Ariandel. I assume she gives her sword to Volnir as a gift, as when we see her, she uses a sickle instead of a sword. Another thing is she also uses the Black Serpent Pyromancy using the illusory sickle she has. Another thing is that I thought Elfrida gave Volnir tips on using Black Flame Pyromancies, which would lead him to an even darker path, which is the Abyss. But I did not think about the enemies of the Iron King arc in Dark Souls 2. So I'm not sure that I agree with this, but I think it's an interesting idea. I think that there were some leaps being made in terms of the specifics of what the contact there might have been, but yeah, it's an interesting idea, and perhaps something we should all keep in mind as we slowly inch our way to the first DLC, which will be near the end of the series. Shogo writes, on the subject of the summonable phantoms and the unkindled ones, in the Ring City DLC there is also an NPC called Lap. Since he is hollowing, we can assume that he is not an unkindled one, yet we can summon him for some of the boss fight. We do know that the thing that causes it is not the dark sign but the dark sigil. What is the relation between those two? Why the unkindled ones do not possess the dark sigil like all other hollows do? Why in Dark Souls 1 were we curing the hollowing by sacrificing the humanity to the fire? Why is it different in Dark Souls 2, and why in Dark Souls 3? So I want to start by talking about where Shogo writes, since Lap is hollowing, we can assume that he is not an unkindled one. I don't think that's true, because I think the type of hollowing that Lap is experiencing is more of an abstract type of hollowing, more of a metaphysical, an ontological type of hollowing. He doesn't know who he is anymore. So I interpreted Lap's questline to suggest that he's not necessarily going through the same type of hollowing that our Aegon of Astora build is, where the pus of humanity is leaking out of him, but he's going through the same sort of existential crisis that Lucatil is in Dark Souls 2, but that's just me. That's just how I see it. So I don't think it necessarily follows that because Lap is losing his sense of self, that he's not an unkindled one. But again, there's lots of question marks in terms of how it is that we can figure out who's unkindled and who isn't. So as for your other questions, I would suggest viewing the comment segment for episode 11, the first episode on the Faron Keep. I read out a comment in that episode by Hunter M. It's a very long comment, but goes into great detail and really does a good job of explaining what is happening in terms of the hollowing in Dark Souls 3. And as for your questions concerning how it's changed from Dark Souls 1 to Dark Souls 2 to Dark Souls 3, I would direct you to episode number 2, the first episode on the High Wall of Lothric, where I responded to a similar comment by doing my best to catalog how hollowing has changed and the physical manifestations of it have changed from Dark Souls 1 to Dark Souls 3. So I hope that you find that helpful, and I'm sorry that I can't answer all of those questions here, we just don't have the time, but we have addressed those other questions that you had in these earlier episodes, so I would recommend that you go back and check that out. Dezo Penguin writes, in honor of the subject matter, I spent the time I listened to this Let's Talk Lore episode diligently farming for Vertebra Shackles. With 422 item discovery, I managed to gather 13. Nothing, I think, so aptly illustrates the point of your discussion of how lone human action cannot accomplish what we can do cooperatively as an offline Dark Souls 3 player farming for multiplayer Covenant items. Very well said, Dezo Penguin, as always. Dezo Penguin goes on to write, one thought I had about the sacrifices Volnir claimed was that perhaps he was attempting to stave off the growing hunger of the Abyss by feeding them to it, in the hope of satiating it. In the end, of course, it seems to have been a futile gesture. Since Volnir himself is not a Lord of Cinder, and thus Carthus is not associated with any particular segment of the timeline or Lord of Cinder's story, do you think it is possible that Carthus's eventual fall came at the hands of the Undead Legion? We know that they were known to utterly destroy a kingdom that showed any sign of the Abyss, and Carthus would certainly qualify. What's interesting though is that the abyssal presence in the catacombs seems to be contained. Of course there are skeletons running around, but apart from the pursuers the Grave Warden skeletons throw, and the ones sealed in the urns, there is no sign of an active dark presence in the way that exists in, say, Ulasil or New Londo or the Ring City or even Lothric Castle. Only Volnir in what seems to be his own private little corner of the Abyss. So, Dezo Penguin, I must apologize because I don't think I can answer your question, but I do think that Yosaho can. Yosaho writes, the way I see how Carthus fits into the story of Dark Souls 3 is quite different. The raid of Demon Ruins, it is the joint forces of Carthus, Drang, Lothric, and Irithyll, with both Carthus and Drang serving as mercenaries. This is why we don't see any desert environment and found some sort of Drang-like items down there. Also at this point, the entire catacombs is still a part of the Demon Ruins. The Giant Slave and the Giant Ballista, these two are very interesting. Even though Carthus is a fearsome army, their warfare seems to be somewhat uncivilized. I don't think that they're able to build a complex siege weapon like that Ballista on their own, especially when we find an Avalon at the Grand Archives, and it is said that this is extremely rare. And we never have been told that Carthus has any giants, so these giants must be supplied by Irithyll, maybe even the Black Knights. Volnir falling into the Abyss. As we see, Carthus's tactics is mostly for man versus man, which is ineffective against the demons. New tactics are necessary. Maybe this was suggested by the Kingdom of Lothric, or Volnir came up with the idea of using the Abyss himself. Regardless, it leads to his own demise, but also he also discovered the Black Flame. Pyromancers became Grave Wardens tending to Volnir's grave and wielded dark instead of fire. Even if Volnir falls into the Abyss, the war still goes on. As with Lorien successfully killing the Demon Prince temporarily and the newly discovered dark power of Carthus, the demons are now in very bad shape, some being cornered in that room, some surrendered. On the Sandworm, a mistranslation on the yellow bug pellets, the worm fell to deep underground. I see the worm as a Carthus bioweapon, uncontrollable but can be manipulated. With yellow bug pellets, they repel the worm to Smouldering Lake and leave it there as a guard, with a lot of delicious crabs, and the giant ballista were put there in case some demons managed to escape the worm. It is also quite easy for the worm to traverse through the catacombs. I don't think Brick Wall will be able to stop that thing. So yeah, that is very well said, and I'm sorry, Yosaho, that we're not getting to this comment until the very end of the episode, because as I was recording the episode, I had completely forgotten about your comment. So yeah, that is a very good way of putting it, that the Carthus Sandworm is potentially a bioweapon. So yeah, thank you very much for this. Yosaho goes on to write about the Abyss Watchers. Now that the demon threat has been eliminated, still some messes need to be cleaned up. Maybe it's because Carthus is involved with the Abyss, maybe the price that Carthus demanded for their service is too high. Regardless, Lothric employs the Abyss Watchers. At this point, they are still a group of itinerants with no lands of their own, to get rid of Carthus. Unlike Carthus, that is swords for sale, the Watchers are more than willing to fight the Abyss. Lothric is also supporting them by sending the Crystal Sage to train their sorcerers. That is the end of Carthus, and the upper part of the Catacombs became Catacombs of Carthus. After that, Lothric gifted what would now be called Fair and Keep to be the base of operations for the Abyss Watchers, not just as a reward, but also as a sneaky way to make them watch over Carthus for the rest of their career. On the Wolfblood drying up, gaining a mission to the Legion is a matter of some ceremony. Inside their keep, snuffing out the flames of 3 altars opens up the door to the Wolf's Blood. Not to the Legion, not to the Mausoleum, door to the Wolf's Blood. But I don't think it is to seal off the Abyss, but rather all current members of the Watchers will shed their blood in this goblet and new recruits will snuff out the flame, make their way here to drink blood from the goblet and join the Watchers. On Volner and reanimation, it is interesting that you guys mention about the skeletons being possessed humanity, thus reanimating them, because if you look at how Volner reanimates his minions, he smashes a huge mass of what was assumed to be humanity to the ground. Alternatively, Volner might be able to cast Black Serpent, and this is the animation for that, but it got cut from the game and replaced with Reanimate spell. Come to think of it, isn't Nito wearing a humanity cloak, and the drop rate of humanity on baby skeletons is very high? Again, excellent points. Not really sure I have much to add other than that's brilliant. On the Blackblade, speaking frankly, the identity of this guest is not important at all, just like the worm. What is important is what the item tells us. Not just Alon, but Easterners tend to leave their land and spreading their culture across the globe, the opposite of Old Japan. We can see this throughout Dark Souls 3, here in Carthus, Easterners' Ashes in Irithyll, Oni Slayer Bow in Profane Capital, and Kamui in Lothric. So yeah, again, I'm not really sure I have much more to add, other than I wish we had read this comment earlier in the episode, so thank you very kindly, Yosaho. That's, I'm not sure I disagree with anything you just said. So yeah, really great stuff, as always, thank you. I'm sorry if I butcher the pronunciation of this, but Sargeras Terrorfire writes, it always made sense to me that Volner was the player character from Dark Souls 2, crushing the 4 crowns into his own that was now useless. The Carthus warriors that are armored also appear similar in both color and plating to the Sanctum Knights in the Sunken King DLC. The Black Blade in the Catacombs suggested that it was filled with mercenaries from outside of Carthus' influence, similar to what King Vendrick did. Marcus Flutist writes, perhaps it was cut in process, but the fact nobody mentions the way Volner is defeated seems strange to me. We do not kill, or is it put to rest or grant true death to him. Unlike many other bosses, we just destroy his armlets and he falls into the abyss. So while Volner is described kinda like Genghis Khan, a merciless conqueror, when he pledged to the gods, they seemed to answer him and were preventing him from falling to the abyss the whole time, until the Asher One decided to pay a visit. Despite all that, stripped from the corpses of clerics and sentenced countless souls to gruesome death stuff, indeed. Also, in my opinion, there's little connection with Carthus in any other area because it is an ancient city and long forgotten kingdom at the moment when bell rings and the Asher One rises, so there's little evidence about its existence at all. Again, like we have a lot less things from the Mongol Empire compared to the Roman one, and maybe here a parallel may be drawn to Anor Londo that stood countless centuries. So the thing about Anor Londo, and we'll discuss this when we actually go to Anor Londo, but Miyazaki has said that Anor Londo is supposed to be interpreted in a more abstract metaphorical sense, not necessarily that literally every single stone has remained in the same place, but I could be remembering that wrong and we don't have the time to discuss that today anyway, so we will return to that. As for why we didn't mention the Volner falling thing, I would chalk that up probably to the format of the episode, the fact that we were doing the commentary while not actually watching footage, but looking at screenshots. So those are the kinds of things that will happen sort of in the opposite direction in terms of there are all these great things that format allows us to accomplish, but this is one area where, you know, we're more likely to miss things if I don't explicitly make a screenshot and say you have to discuss this. So yeah, my apologies for that, but I thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. And to everyone else who shared their thoughts on everything that we discussed in this episode, my sincerest apologies once again if I didn't read your comment, but that's going to do it for this one. So thank you all very, very much for joining me, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.